Hello, everyone. It's Calvin Andrassy again, and today we're going to be talking about the construction of knowledge, or essentially an examination of what we call epistemology, which is the study of what is knowledge and what kind of separates fact from a mere opinion. Um, so, without further ado, let's go ahead and jump into that a little bit here. So, now, the first question here is, why do you believe what you believe? So, in order to, establish beliefs that are essentially grounded in reality, you want to engage in a process of vigorous discussion and debate. And you want to explore all sides of an issue, all the justifications for each of these alternative viewpoints, and use that to ultimately settle on what you think is the best explanation of what's going on. So it's all about constantly reflecting on what it is that you have experienced in the world and what your perceptions are, and challenging those perceptions, seeing if they stand up to scrutiny, essentially. So, of course, you start with perception, and much of the knowledge that you have of the world begins with perception. But you have to start to use your thinking abilities in order to be able to examine those perceptions and those initial inclinations about the way the world works in a more critical fashion. So, you want to you basically want to uh, continue to explore and examine your beliefs and what your assumptions are about the world around you. And in so doing, you're going to be more informed about the way the world operates, and all of the world's phenomena will be better illuminated through this exploration and critical examination of everything that you hold to be true about whatever it is that you are exploring. Okay. So, of course, we start with our beliefs here, our interpretations, evaluations, conclusions, and predictions about the world. And then we go down one of two paths here. Either we have direct experience that influences those beliefs, or we have indirect experience that influences those beliefs. So that can be any type of recorded message, so anything that is orally or written um, to provide you with information. But of course, you have to take a major step if it isn't a direct experience, and sit back and think about, how reliable is the information from which you're coming to your conclusions? How reliable is the source of the information itself? And if you're able to come to a pretty reasonable conclusion that the information that is provided is something that is trustworthy, then you can begin to develop knowledge from that information. And of course, you want to think critically about those beliefs in order to turn it into what we would consider to be knowledge. So, some things to kind of ask yourself in that regard: are those beliefs compelling, and are they coherent explanations of the phenomenon that you're exploring? Are the beliefs consistent with other beliefs and other knowledge? Are the beliefs capable of producing predictions that are accurate? Are your beliefs supported by reasons and evidence? Is there an empirical basis for those beliefs, essentially? And are those beliefs based on reliable sources in the case of indirect experience as well? Is there any reason that somebody would lie to you? Is there any reason that the information might be incomplete, or that there is missing information that needs to be provided in order to get a true, complete, and holistic understanding of whatever the phenomenon ultimately is? Okay. So, that all being said, knowing or knowledge is the ability to distinguish beliefs supported by reasons or experience from beliefs that can be disproved by evidence, okay, or that does not have a sufficient amount of evidence to back it up, essentially. Okay. People can still have beliefs without the appropriate evidence, but without that evidence, there's no reason to accept those beliefs as true, and therefore part of the knowledge base on which you can reasonably act and make meaningful decisions about the world. Okay, So that all being said, then, beliefs are also interpretations, evaluations, conclusions, and predictions about the world that we endorse as true. So the beliefs are the basis for a lot of the decision making, essentially, that we make as individuals starting to think about the world and how it ultimately operates. Knowledge, then, would be the beliefs about the world that we believe are true and for which there is some sort of a compelling reason, or there is a sufficient amount of empirical, unbiased, objective evidence to support those beliefs. Okay, so that's where we're essentially starting in our exploration of knowledge here. So obviously, the beliefs that we form vary pretty significantly in accuracy. I oftentimes do an exploration about little bits and pieces of things that I heard when I was young, look into them, and I find, even though for 40 years perhaps I believed them to be true, upon a more scrutinous examination of the information, I find that those things aren't always necessarily true, right? So the beliefs that you form, they vary in accuracy very, very significantly and very tremendously. And so, of course, the idea of knowing is the ability to distinguish beliefs that are supported by strong reasons or evidence from those beliefs for which there is less support, as well as those that can be outright disproved because of evidence to the contrary, right? Um, I am a firm believer that the world is round and not flat. Apparently, there are still people that believe the world is flat, but there is so much contrary evidence, mountains of it essentially, that I would argue disproves that assertion. Um, and there is very significant information available to us, photographic records and just general uh, explanations about certain phenomena in the world that would lend itself to a round Earth being a far more plausible and likely scenario than a flat Earth ever would be. Okay, so the distinction between believing and knowing um, is, of course, illustrated by examining statements with the words believe or the words know in them. So, I know that I will die is one example of such a statement. I also believe that I will die someday. Is it a guarantee? It's pretty much, there's very, very few situations under which I might not die. And, technology would have to advance by leaps and bounds in order for that to be the case, right? I know that life exists on other planets. Well, I mean, I think it is a pretty bold assertion to say that only planet Earth has life. However, without evidence to back it up, I cannot fully assert that life exists on other planets. Um, I would say that I do strongly believe that some sort of life exists on other planets. Now, whether those alien life forms have visited Earth, that is another requires another degree of evidence in order for me to assert knowledge of that being the case, and I have not yet seen definitive empirical information that would suggest that. Interestingly enough, some members of the military have testified before Congress, asserting that the United States has alien technology in its possession, but even still, that is not compelling enough evidence for me to fully assert that alien life has in any way visited planet Earth. Now, show me evidence that these assertions are true, and I might change my tune. But until such time, I'm not intending to change my belief and remain cautiously, perhaps optimistic, but still asserting that it is just a mere belief without necessarily establishing, against the evidentiary base to assert knowledge about that particular topic. I know that working hard will lead me to a happy life, right? Again, that is a belief. Some people work incredibly hard, but unfortunately, are not necessarily happy. So there is that possibility always ever present in any type of similar philosophical assertion, unfortunately. And then, of course, there's the idea that I know the earth is flat. Well, I would say that there is contrary evidence, and indeed, I would not have that knowledge. In fact, I would reject the assertion that the earth is flat. Okay? So, again, the only statement which most people would agree clearly makes sense to use the word no is the first one, again, because there is conclusive evidence. Basically, everybody that has ever lived has died or is going to die at some point, probably within the next 100 to 120 or so years, right? In the case of statement number two, which is about life on other planets, perhaps there is a possibility of life on other planets, but there still isn't that conclusive evidence. For statement three, the situation isn't always 100% set in stone. Some people work really hard, but they don't necessarily achieve what they set out to achieve. And of course, there are many other factors and many other variables that play into that. So we're not able to assert our knowledge in that regard. And then of course the last one, knowing something that is not true, the belief is completely inaccurate. And there's plenty of reasons that would go against that. So, while some people may believe the earth is flat, I would be compelled to show them the evidence that would suggest otherwise, perhaps to get them to change their beliefs, perhaps under some circumstances not. Okay, so justification of beliefs, right? That is the evidence or the rationale or reasons behind why you have certain beliefs. And of course, determining the accuracy and the justification for your beliefs can sometimes be a bit of a challenge. It's not the easiest thing in the world to back up your beliefs with substantial evidence, but you have to try to do that. Whether it be to try to find evidence from authorities or individuals that would provide you with indirect information about that topic, or to have your own direct experiences, perhaps through scientific research or some other means of directly experiencing the phenomenon that you're exploring, right? But as a critical thinker, you need to try to form and revise your beliefs so that you can understand the world in increasingly effective ways, which means those ways that are actually based in reality and are true. So even when you find that you maintain certain beliefs over a long period of time, sometimes your explorations result in a deeper and fuller understanding of these beliefs. And, as an example of situations in which sometimes you might find that what you used to believe is not true, I urge everybody to Google the Mandela effect, which is a series of situations that large numbers of people believe something to be true, but the reality is that they were not true. So a large number of people believe that Nelson Mandela died sometime in the 1990s, when that was not necessarily the case, and he lived on, I believe, well into the 2000s. There are some other ones like the Berenstain Bears was a popular series of children books, but some people believe that the name was spelled differently with an E instead of an A, which apparently the original books were written with an A. So, sometimes, if you do a little bit of extra digging, you might find that your memories and the things that you believe to be true might not necessarily be the way that you think that they are. Okay? So the road to becoming a critical thinker is a challenging journey that involves passing through different stages of knowing. Okay? And we're going to kind of go into some of those stages of knowing. And they do kind of get progressively more complex as you move forward. So this is based on Dr. William Perry. Stage number one is the Garden of Eden stage. Stage number two is called the Anything Goes stage. And then stage number three is the critical thinking or thinking critically stage. And, the way that you think about the world is based on your past experiences, perhaps the age that you are in, um, how old you are, your level of maturity, but also um, your involvement in academia, perhaps your involvement in regarding certain uh, phenomena that you may have direct or indirect experience with. So, most people try to or tend to be within one particular stage for the bulk of their lives, but it is possible to transition from one stage to the other. So we start with the Garden of Eden stage, and again, I don't want to necessarily go into all the nitty gritty here, but that is the idea of individuals accepting as reality that which authorities have ultimately told them, right? So this reflects the biblical tale of the Garden of Eden, where you had Adam and Eve, and the authority figure there, God, tells them that they shouldn't partake of the tree of life. It contains knowledge and will ultimately lead to their mortality. But they do transgress, right? They do go beyond simply accepting authority, and they hope to find out for themselves, essentially, right? But people in the Garden of Eden stage, they generally become dissatisfied when they realize that they simply can't always rely on authorities for everything that they believe in their lives, right? A lot of people perhaps that are less educated and whatnot, they do rely on authorities because they haven't necessarily developed the capabilities for critical thinking. But there's lots of different areas of life in which authorities kind of dictate what it is that we should be doing. And if we find contradictory information in our own personal experiences, sometimes that worldview can kind of fall apart. So, in medicine, religion, economics, psychology, education, science, law, and child rearing, we listen to the authorities and things don't always work out the way that we expect, right? Medicine, works with Occam's razor and generally tends to go with the diagnosis that makes the most sense, essentially, given the circumstances. Sometimes things don't act typically, right? You wind up that somebody has some sort of a disease or a condition that is not what would be expected medically, right? Economically, I think the recent years are a fantastic explanation where perhaps somebody looking at things purely from a theoretical economic basis would say the economy is doing great. We had substantial growth, relative low amount of unemployment, and inflation levels dropped. But at the same time, inflation was really high a couple of years ago, and prices didn't go back down. It's just that, no longer are we getting, double digit inflation, but we're down to 2% inflation. So there could be a big disconnect there between what theoretically is true and what perhaps personal experience would suggest is not necessarily true, right? So there is that. So if authorities disagree with one another, then how do we figure out what and whom to believe, right? So if you do stay in this initial stage, this is a contradiction where individuals say, well, my authorities say this and your authorities are wrong, right? So um, it's uncritical, blind acceptance of the information that is being provided by authorities. And just as Adam and Eve in the Garden of Eden couldn't go back to being blind and uncritically accept authority once they tasted the fruit of the tree of knowledge of good and evil, so too is it very difficult to return to stage one after recognizing that it's inadequate because of its oversimplifications. Okay? So then why are some people able to go beyond stage one while others remain more or less stuck in that area throughout their lives? Well, of course, part of the answer is environment. Oftentimes people live in familiar, comfortable, homogeneous, or very homogeneity essentially means sameness, where everything remains more or less static and the same. They're often surrounded by people who think and believe the same way that they do. And in those circumstances, it's easy to have this Garden of Eden style thinking, right? I think my mother would probably be quick to agree that, growing up in a relatively poor part of rural Hungary, she didn't get exposed to alternate viewpoints as often as somebody perhaps living in a major city like Los Angeles or New York, that's cosmopolitan, where you're exposed to multiple viewpoints, and have to kind of mesh things out based on critical thinking, rather than simply relying on authorities and those people around you to kind of tell you what it is that you need to think and do and believe. Okay, so when people are exposed to diverse experiences, that challenges them to come up with competing perspectives, and it becomes more difficult to maintain that Garden of Eden stage. We're going to go ahead and jump up to stage 2 here. Hold on one second. The PowerPoint slide has gotten stuck for some reason. Hopefully that will fix itself. One moment, please. All right, my apologies. As my uncle likes to say, buy technology, buy a problem. So we had a little bit of a hiccup there. So now moving on to stage 2. So once you've rejected dogmatism and the authoritarian framework of stage 1, stage 2 is to essentially go to the opposite extreme and believe that anything goes. So oftentimes people think, if authorities aren't infallible, how can we trust their expertise and their experiences? And ultimately, why is one worldview better than the other, right? Of course, you can probably see the fallacies regarding that line of thinking. But, in stage 1, authorities were able to resolve disputes. But then if, authorities aren't there anymore, or authorities can't be trusted, then there's no rational way to resolve disputes. My line of thinking is equally as good as your line of thinking. And of course, as critical thinkers, you probably already can see where the problems lie with regard to that. So that's basically a tradition in philosophy referred to as relativism. And the idea there is that the truth is relative to an individual or a situation or circumstances, and it is whatever applies in the given circumstances that is the reality of the time, right? For example, fashion. You may believe that what is considered to be attractive is a certain set of circumstances. Here it suggests loose-fitting clothing, muted colors, a natural hairstyle, minimum makeup and jewelry. But then other people might suggest, well, no, tight-fitting black clothing and gelled hair and tattoos and body piercings are more attractive, right? So in that case, there is a degree of relativism. Those are personal preferences, and they're simply a matter of taste. What is considered to be attractive to one person or even one generation to the next. Themes and trends in fashion tend to change over time. In that case, relativism kind of makes sense, but that cannot be applied to all matters, right? Only matters of taste, right? The very famous quote is that the customer is always right in matters of taste. But the expansion to that is that, it doesn't mean that they're right on everything, though. And in that case, relativism perhaps isn't the best way of approaching most of the things in the world, right? So you have your beliefs, I have my beliefs, and stage 2 thinkers probably would assert there's no way for you to prove me wrong, or vice versa. And that's sort of the logical way of thinking in this stage of thinking. It's there's no way whatsoever that anything that I think or that you think can be disproved. So then you can't condemn any action, you can't praise any action, no matter what it is. But of course, I think most people find relatively quickly that no, there are some things that there is a decent basis for asserting or rejecting certain ideas or certain claims. And of course, that is the critical thinking stage, which we've been kind of exploring here for the last few videos. But the idea behind critical thinking is that you have to have reasons. There has to be the employment of rationality and judgment and the application of human reason to be able to support viewpoints. So finding compelling reasons to support the viewpoints that you have, that there has to be a basis for your belief. And it's not that you can't disprove my perspective or what have you. Again, on matters of taste, that's fine. I prefer, I do this. That's all fine. And there's nothing that, anybody can really say to challenge that. But if I say, this pencil is primarily blue and clear, I have a basis for that argument. So you saying that it's green and yellow would be an incorrect assertion because, based on the color spectrum here, we would refer to this color as blue, and this portion is indeed clear because it is not entirely transparent, but it is translucent. So anybody that that I would posit this pencil is blue and clear would probably agree with me based on the evidence that would suggest that that information is the way that it is, right? So then we have something that is more of a matter of morality here, which is the idea of euthanasia. So euthanasia is when it comes from the Greek meaning good death. It's the idea that if somebody is suffering and is likely to die from a fatal disease or a fatal condition, euthanasia is to essentially end their lives so that they don't have to go through that suffering and they have what's the Greeks would refer to as a good or beautiful death. So, of course, a stage 3 thinker would approach the issue by, again, trying to understand the different viewpoints, the different perspectives, the pros and cons of either side, and then ultimately evaluate those reasons for the support of those viewpoints and come to their own conclusion, right? And then if asked for the rationale, they should have evidence or reasons behind why they have the viewpoint that they ultimately have. But at the same time, perhaps a stage 3 thinker, a critical thinker, would maintain an open mind and be willing to consider new evidence that could have them change their position or modify their position, perhaps taking a thesis and finding antithetical information to synthesize a new thesis or understanding or general explanation about the way the world operates, which is the Hegelian dialectic, by the way. Okay, so critical thinkers are open to different perspectives, but they do commit themselves to definitive points of view, again, based on rationality and evidence. So what are the reasons? What is the empirical basis for the conclusions that you ultimately have come to? Okay, so I'm going to go ahead and skip ahead here. Thinking critically about your beliefs then, right? To evaluate your beliefs, if you are a critical thinker, you're going to apply some degree of standards in intellectualism to assess the strength and the accuracy of those beliefs. So again, some of the bases of beliefs are, authorities, written references, factual evidence, or personal experiences. You have to think of the pros and cons of each of these, right? Just because something is an authority or that it is written doesn't necessarily mean that the understanding of what's going on is necessarily complete, or that perhaps individuals are applying faulty reason or using faulty evidence to come to the conclusions that they've come to. Similarly, with your personal experiences, perhaps you have biases, or you experienced the situation or the circumstances in a fundamentally different way from other people, right? So let's say you bake yourself a cake, right? Well, let's say you don't know it, but you accidentally replace the sugar with salt. So you have the cake, it's this salty mass of ugh, and now you think, oh, cakes are terrible. I never want to eat another cake again, right? Sometimes personal experience doesn't play out the way that you would expect it to. And again, it's on that basis of the circumstances that surround it, okay? So some things to kind of ask yourself about each of these different stages, right? Authorities. Are the authorities knowledgeable, right? Are they reliable? Have they ever given inaccurate information, and do authorities disagree, right? As an example, I love my parents. We get along. I visit them just about every week. Um, but it was sometime around high school or college that I came to the realization that they don't necessarily know everything about the world, especially with regard to matters pertaining to education and academia. Neither of my parents attended college, so I was the in first generation of college attendees, and so I pretty quickly realized that if I was trying to get information from them or uh, get their opinions about something related to school, I probably shouldn't pay attention to that and do the opposite. I kind of exaggerate there, but I quickly came to realize that they were not good authorities on what I should be doing in college. Written references, right? What are the credentials of the author? Do others disagree with their opinions? Have they been challenged? And on what evidence do the authors base their opinions, right? There are plenty of self help books out there and plenty of philosophies out there about the way people should live their lives or ways that they can improve their lives. And a lot of them are essentially meritless and, I would take with a pretty significant grain of salt. Just because it's written down doesn't necessarily mean that it is true. Next up, what are the sources and foundations of factual evidence? And can the evidence be interpreted differently? And does the evidence support the conclusion? And how often do people assert things as true or fact when they are mere opinion, right? Take, for example, just about any topic that Republicans and Democrats differ on. Just because you belong to one party or another, you believe that oftentimes most of the ideas that your party presents are true or more true. But, if you were to look at the other side, perhaps, you might find that a lot of the things that are being asserted on the other side are just as true. And oftentimes it's a matter of taste and just a matter of preference. And, in some cases, things that are presented as true by one side or the other are done so in a way that isn't necessarily 100% true because they want it to be ideologically consistent rather than consistent with reality. And that can be a big problem as well. So, you got to always question, what is the evidence that, is the basis of the assertion that one perspective is more true than the other? And then, of course, you have personal experience. What were the circumstances under which the evidence took place? And were there distortions or mistakes in perception possible? And have other people had either similar or conflicting experiences? And then, of course, are there other explanations for the experience, right? I always had a general rule to, try something 3 times before settling on whether or not I believed that it was good or not good. So, you have something on 3 separate occasions. Only then would I come to a conclusion about whether I dislike it or not, right? So, I had to try different foods before I decided, this really isn't for me. And again, trying it multiple times just to see if there were alternative explanations to the experience that I may have had the first time around. All right. So next up, beliefs based on indirect experience. So, we depend on direct experience of other people sometimes to help us provide us with a basis of the beliefs that we have. Individuals perhaps have visited other countries, and we rely on their explanations of their experiences to help us decide perhaps whether or not we should visit that country as well, doing some international travel perhaps, right? But you always have to ask yourself, how reliable is the person who's providing the information about the experience? Much like the same way as you would examine direct experience as well. All righty. So next up, how reliable are the information and the source, right? Has the source of the information made accurate observations? And what do we know about the reliability of the source? And of course, how knowledgeable or experienced is the source pertaining to whatever it is that is being explored, right? So, how do we choose sources more likely to be reliable, right? This is the era of fake news, and of course, with artificial intelligence and the ability to manipulate images, anything goes out there in the world, and it's often very difficult to um, rest on the laurels of something necessarily being true or based in reality. Again, if it's written or even now presented in some sort of a visual medium, um, because there are unreliable sources, unfortunately, out there. Okay, so what sources are more likely to get the information that you're looking for? Well, we've got .edu websites that are educational or research-based organizations, so universities and things like that, as well as a lot of the different research firms out there might have a .edu as part of their domain name. You've got .gov, which would usually be a government resource. Oftentimes, they try to provide objective information. Again, it depends, perhaps, on which government we might be looking at, or which sector of the government we might be exploring to get that information. But I think, generally speaking, something with a .gov would tend to be more reliable than a lot of other organizations. .com refers to commercial products or commercially sponsored sites. So if you are looking at that, there is the possibility that there is not reliable information being presented, or perhaps biased information being presented. Commercial means somebody's trying to make money, so perhaps that is something that might need to be factored in. And then, of course, .org would be nonprofit organizations, oftentimes presenting information for program evaluative purposes and things like that, to make sure compliance with whatever it is that they needed to do in order to secure a grant or something like that. So oftentimes they tend to be somewhat reputable, but at the same time, sometimes these kinds of websites might be problematic, right? So if you see a website like chase.com or cnn.com, perhaps you would think that those are very reliable websites in general, but you might see that there are modifications to the URL. Like, for example, here we've got cnn.com.de, which would be Deutschland, which is the German extension, which means that it's not actually cnn.com, but rather some sort of a website coming out of Germany, or chase.com.homeland.com. Homeland.com is actually the one that's hosting the site, so it's not actually Chase. So, if you're trying to type in your bank information, perhaps whoever owns homeland.com is actually trying to steal that information. So don't necessarily just accept the opinion of the first sources that you locate. Dig into it, make sure that the information is indeed consistent with being a reliable source of that information.